Steve Pemberton, so incredible to have you here on the ChooSELove podcast. Steve is a best-selling author, philanthropist, acclaimed speaker, and senior level executive for the likes of Monster.com, Walgreens, and WorkHuman. Steve's story is about defying seemingly insurmountable odds to become a trailblazing corporate executive, enlightened diversity leader, visionary youth advocate, and acclaimed speaker. His best-selling memoir, A Chance in the World, recounts his triumphant life journey and drive to become a man of resilience, determination, and vision. There's a major motion picture as well, A Chance in the World, to further amplify Steve's highly motivational message: believe in your dreams, rise above obstacles, create opportunities for others, and most of all, persevere. You also have another book, The Lighthouse Effect, which is an idea that any of us immersed in the hustle and bustle of our lives, wrestling with our own ambitions and imperfections, can pause and change the arc of the life of another and find one for ourselves. Steve, thank you so much for being here today with us. This message, your message, just resonates so deeply with me.
Thank you, Scarlett, so much for that. And thank you so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. You know, the book was a really hard thing to read. Your life is I have to tell you, I don't know. I guess maybe I'm extra sensitive because, of course, I've had a child that was murdered. But for me, any time that I read about a child that's abused, it's just so incredibly hard for me to, and you took us through your story of that. And it's so important that we sit with this discomfort and not only that, but take some amount of responsibility for it. That's been my message from the beginning, not just point fingers and blame and fault find, but also hold ourselves accountable for our children's health and well-being. And it doesn't just mean ours, it means our children out there, and change the things that aren't working, because each one of us is so powerful. We can do a lot. And indeed, we have to do something, because what we're doing now isn't working. Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome is the definition of insanity. And of course, for you, we're specifically talking about the foster care system that you went through. Can you share a little bit of for our listeners that maybe haven't read your story yet or watched the movie yet, what that was like for you?
So much of the story is and does lie in the title of the book and the movie, A Chance in the World. It's a commonly held refrain, but in my case, it had a very, very specific meaning. It came from the diary entry of a babysitter who saw me at 1.5 years old. My mother was in the midst of a losing battle with alcoholism. My father, unknown and unidentified by her, was not in my life. And this babysitter, who was actually the father of my mother's friend, was often tasked with coming to pick me up. And my mother would make arrangements for somebody to take care of me for a period of time, a day or so. Well, she said it was a day, but sometimes it became a week. And this became something of a routine. And, you know, the babysitter, the father of my mother's friend, sees this happening all the time, and says, he kept a diary, and he said of me, this little boy doesn't have a chance in the world. And many, many years later, his daughter, my mother's friend, found me and shared that diary entry with me. I was then a young dad. And when I saw that, I kind of smiled, because I thought that it symbolized exactly what I was seeking all along. And that any of us are actually reflections of. If you're standing in the world today, it's because somebody gave you a chance in the world. And oftentimes when you see the opposite of that, it's because others may have been denied that very chance. So growing up in the foster care system, taken from my mother at the age of 3, largely because of my appearance and my case file. I never saw her again. The month that I entered into foster care, with this one foster home where I stayed for over 11 years, my father, I would learn much, much later, was murdered. But the fact of the matter is that both of them have been gone from me for a long time, even before their passings. And my mother died when I was 8. I knew none of this until many, many years later. So what unfortunately happened is what is happening far too often today, that children are quite literally getting lost. And there are some places that you just can't imagine this is happening in America. But the system is, you're exactly right, it is strained. You have some wonderful, wonderful people, Scarlett, they're trying to do the best that they can.
I know.
I mean, they're really angels who walk
Yes.
amongst us, and they carry the weight and the emotional burden of not being able to protect children, but they're doing their best. So it's a reflection of a lot of other breakdowns in society that are landing on children in particular.
I completely agree. So here is this 1.5-year-old little boy who doesn't have a chance in the world. We're all familiar with we're all familiar, but a trajectory, a path that you could have gone down would have been maybe just duplicating the way you were treated, not only by a mom who was in pain, by a father who was in pain, but also by parents that were foster parents to you, that used you for income, that abused you, that treated you not even like a human being deserves to be treated, without dignity. And you could have thought that about yourself. You could have, nobody would have blamed you if you had been so angry that you had lashed out and maybe resorted to crime, wound up in prison, but you didn't. And how did you do? Why do some go down that path and some don't? And what's the difference?
It's that age-old debate and question: is it nature versus nurture? That is debated in psychological circles and social work circles. In sociology, there's a similar debate: agency versus structure. Agency is the individual person. What dictates and determines our life? Is it our own individual agency, or is it structures around us? Which one is it? And I've actually found both those questions to be slightly misleading, because the answers is anchored in an either or, when in fact, I think it's much more likely to be a both and. That there's got to be some desire to move beyond that circumstance, but you also have to see the possibilities in order to do so. And that, for me, was the distinction, I think, between my mother's life and my father's life and mine. I was actually the third generation to be orphaned. I was the third generation to lose a mother at 40. I was just next. And yet it avoided me, or I avoided it, right? Depending on your view. It
didn't avoid you, though, because you were going down the same path of pain and rejection. So it actually didn't avoid you. You avoided it.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
I didn't mean to stop you, but I just, yeah.
Yeah, but here's why.
Keep going. Sorry.
Here's why I think it did. Why the cycle's not repeated. That there's not another generation, right? So there's not a fourth generation. My children know nothing of this. Couldn't. They've read about it, but that's as far as it goes. They understand nothing about it. And I think for me, it was these everyday people who came into my life at just the right time, most times unknowingly. They did not know the effect and the impact that they were having on me. So we often say that sometimes it just takes one kind, caring adult. I'm not even sure the bar is that high. I think sometimes it's one kind, caring interaction. Let me give you an example. I loved to read. Reading was my sanctuary. It was a safe place for me, the safest place I ever knew. No one judged me in the books I read. I developed imagination and vision of a different life. And so it actually seeded this idea that there was a different life for me. But that in and of itself wasn't sufficient. I needed a lighthouse. And it came to me in the form of this woman who would bring me books. And she did that for the 11 years that I was in this very, very difficult foster home. Most times I never saw her. I saw the box of books that she brought. And I poured myself into them. So it made me a good student. It made me a good writer. It gave me some capabilities with the spoken word. I was very quiet as a young boy. In other words, you need this meeting of those two worlds. Claire Levin was her name. Claire, very humble, high school education, stay-at-home mom her whole life, but she was very much a lighthouse. She had an enormous impact upon me. And I think it's true for a lot of us. We don't realize that it's in the interaction. That was an interaction, right? I didn't live with her. She didn't take me in, but it was that interaction of seeing in me something that nobody else at that point in my life saw. We each have that power, that capability to impact somebody's life like that.
We talk about it as having the courage to step outside of your own busyness and distraction, even pain and suffering that we all have. We all have something going on to help somebody else. We call it compassion in action, and we're all capable of that. But it does take courage, even when approaching a kid that you see reading and saying, hey, you like books? I have some extras. I'm going to drop them off. And then, going out of your way. It's easier just to walk on by. And it's incredible. And what a incredible message that kindness, and it goes beyond kindness. It's literal caring, because it goes way beyond kindness when it's 11 years of consistently bringing you books and not having any idea that behind that closed door, you're getting abused and you're not being respected. I'm sure sometimes she didn't even know if you were going to be getting the books, but she kept doing it. And that is really incredible. And I love this message of one interaction, because sometimes I think it seems so overwhelming. Sometimes it seems, this is what I do for a living now. And sometimes it seems overwhelming to me because there's so much pain in the world. And you talk about, what can I do as a single person? But if you look at the power of one interaction and how that love, that loving kindness, that caring helped shape your life, was a lighthouse. I love the Lighthouse Effect. I love that whole concept, because each one of us can be a lighthouse in that. And we can make the difference between life or death. And I really believe that's what it was for you ultimately.
Sure. And not only can we be a lighthouse, but perhaps we already are and just don't know it. The lighthouse, it takes no inventory of the lives it has altered and changed. In fact, it doesn't even know who it saves and who it guides. It never knows. That's true for us as human beings too. You never know who is taking example from your strength, from your conviction, from your courage. You never know that. Now, in some cases we do, but by and large, you're not really, really aware. Many years later, I had the opportunity to sit down with Claire. I had lost contact with her when I left that neighborhood when I was 16, and I thought I was never going to see her again, actually. And I did, because I wrote my first book, and people went looking for her, found her, and said, hey, there's this man who's written about you. And she had remembered me. And of course, I had remembered her. And I was always curious to know, so where did that come from? Like, why would you do that? You're right, Scarlett. Why, over 11 years, not knowing the outcome, why would you keep doing that? And her answer, I thought, was both fascinating and instructive. She said, I was doing what my mother told me to do. which was to give from where you are with whatever you have. So my mother would always say that, give from where you are with whatever you have. And what her mother meant by that was that you did not need to be wealthy, that if you could only give a smile on that day, then you give a smile. If you can only give a box of books, then give a box of books. Give what you have from wherever you are, whatever station in life you are. And there's also this implied message of not only should you do that, but you have a responsibility to do that. And so she didn't think it was anything other than a value, a trait that her mother embodied and reflected. You know, you said something else that's so important about looking at how large some of these societal problems seem to be. I'm just a single individual. You know, what can I do? The 10 people that I wrote about in the Lighthouse Effect all demonstrated a certain kind of courage, like the Lighthouse does. They've all been through something very, very difficult, very difficult. Whether it was the diagnosis of autism, whether it was being orphaned, whether it was losing a child to a mental health crisis, whether it was having a parent die in your arms when you were 16. They all went through something very difficult. But their response to it and the courage that they showed, I think, in battling through that, all was for a very specific reason. And it was so that they could encourage somebody else. So it was having the courage, but to encourage somebody else, because sometimes the pain of our past is a present reality for someone else who sees in our victory the possibility of their own. So that is why if you have overcome something or dealt with something very difficult, you have that responsibility. And in doing so, it's painful to walk down that path. There are people, Scarlett, I know whose life you touch, and you have to walk down that same path of losing a child to encourage them. And that's difficult. That's hard to do because I've got to relive some of this again. I've got to show my own kind of courage so that I can try to encourage them so that they can see a way through, because I know what that pain feels like. I know what that storm feels like. I know what it feels like to be lost in the storm and uncertain. The Lighthouse, in a way, is willing to wrestle with its own pain to help you through yours. We can all do that and be that.
That is so beautiful. And in fact, I've thought a lot about that over the course of the last year. And I've realized, not just over the course of the last year, the course of the last 8 years of my journey. And I've realized that it is a huge part of my healing.
Yes.
To do that.
Yes.
So it's incredible, Steve, to me, how the more we give, we get all of that back. I say the nurturing, healing love that we give out, we get back. But every time I put myself in the position of using my story, sharing my story, and more important than my story is what I've learned from my story to help other people. Every time it helps me. I mean, people have said, gosh, how can you tell your story so many times and relive it? But every time I do, it's healing to me. I get so much love back. So I agree with you. Not only is it a responsibility, but actually it's part of the healing process. And I'll even take it as far as to say, I think it's why we're here on earth, to learn from, grow through, and be strengthened by our experiences. And then one step further, to use what we've learned to help other people. It's just, that's why we're here. Do you agree?
I do. And that's giving from a place not of the elevated station, because right now, or far too often, advice, counsel comes from a place of title, of celebrity, of affluence, when I think the most resonant counsel comes from somebody who has walked down that road and know what it is like. In the addiction world, there is a commonly held refrain about someone who likens addiction to be down in falling through a manhole cover. And one person walks by and says, I'm going to go call and get help. And then another person walks by and says, I'll pray for you. And then a third person jumps down there with you. And you say to them, well, why'd you jump down here? Now we're both stuck.
Yeah.
And to which the person says, yeah, you're right. We are both down here, but I've been here before and I know the way out. It's a very different, that's a very different approach, right? To helping someone through. And it may be the only thing that really heals us. Now the scars will always be there. There are things that you've lost, that I've lost, that can never be returned. There is no such thing as getting whole with some things, but the pain of that can be as wide as a 6-lane highway. But by helping others, you can get it down to the single country road that doesn't seem to overwhelm you. And you now know, and those we've lost know, that it was not in vain, that the loss was not in vain, actually, and that you've helped navigate somebody else through a similar trial and tribulation. I don't know if there's a better way to love humankind than that. I'm not convinced that there is.
That's beautiful. And then the act of offering that up to others makes it not in vain. Yes. Helps Jesse's murder to not be in vain because he's helped so many other people. I have one more passerby to add to the manhole scenario. I have the passerby that looks down in the hole and goes, yeah, you're exactly where you deserve to be because you made the choices to get there, and sorry for you, but blaming, finger pointing, fault finding, judging, and then walks on by self-righteously.
Yeah, and isn't that a lot of what we're seeing in the world today, right? We certainly see this on the medium that is social media, right, where you are judged and tried and assumed. Something came across my wire just earlier today about a judgment of a celebrity, and they called it shaming and what have you. And that's always struck me as kind of curious, as they themselves have never been in a similar situation where they needed understanding and or support, or somebody they loved needed understanding. And yet, isn't that the beauty of the lighthouse? That the lighthouse itself does not qualify your distress, nor does it render judgment on your uncertainty or being in a bad spot. It does not say, well, didn't you know a storm was coming? It doesn't say, well, didn't you sail this way before? Didn't you know that there was a reef over there? Didn't you know that? It doesn't say any of those things. It doesn't ask you your race. It doesn't ask you your gender. It doesn't give a damn who you voted for in the last election, because what the lighthouse sees is your humanity. That's what it sees. And so therefore, that's all it's concerned about. It's only concerned about your humanity. And in moments of stress and challenge and difficulty, if we can see that in someone else, then boy, there is some power in that. The point of being healed, the first person that I wrote about in the Lighthouse Effect was the man who took me in when I was 16 years old. His name was John Sykes. John, a bachelor, living on his own, Scarlett, no responsibilities other than being a teacher and a counselor. And then he gets this call 3 days after Christmas. Can you take in this 16-year-old kid? Now, years later, I asked John about that very phone call because I needed a miracle. And I'd been in my social worker's office all day. They couldn't find me placement. And I mentioned John to them because I overheard him say something really nice about me. And years later, I asked him about that phone call from the social worker. And he said that he had the phone in one ear, and he says, talk to my social worker. He says, but in the other ear, he's having a conversation with God. And I already knew about the conversation with the social worker, but the one with God, I didn't know about that one. I said, well, what were the two of you talking about? And here's what he said. He said, I was trying to convince God that I wasn't good enough to do this, that I'm alone, I'm a bachelor, I'm also an alcoholic, I know it, I haven't told anybody about it. God, I'm not good enough to take in this boy. And I said, well, what did God say back to you? And he said, well, what I heard back was, you may not trust you, but I trust you. This young boy's out of options. He's got nowhere to go. And for John, he would say many years later, exactly your point, that his pathway through addiction came because he realized in that moment, I'm battling this demon that is addiction, but God still thinks I have worth and I have value, and that I can actually impact this young boy's life. Now, it didn't mean that he entered in recovery immediately. It took him some time. And in fact, it probably got worse after I left when I went to college a year later, because I was his purpose for a while. But what he in essence said was that, yes, was I Steve's lighthouse? I was, and he surely was. But he said he was also mine too.
That is so beautiful. That's just so authentic. We all feel at times like we're not capable of what's being put in front of us, that we're not worthy, we're not enough. I mean, all of us have those moments. I certainly do. And you're right, because I do believe that we're chosen for our purpose, and that God believes that we can do it, or he wouldn't have put that in front of us, for sure.
That's right. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And when we think about the people in our life and how they show up and the reasons that they show up, and it all has to do with their own journeys, right? Their own journeys. I've never subscribed to this idea that, you had to be of a community. You don't have to be part of the disability community to know that access is a challenge, or to be fully seen as a member of the LGBTQ community, for example. A lot of us know what it's like to be on the periphery of something, or in the shadows, to not be fully seen or valued. All of us, doesn't matter what walk of life you've come from, you know what it's like to be the other. And because you've had that experience, though it may be temporary, you have the ability to understand somebody else's experience, and therefore offer that kind word, that gesture, standing, in the gap. And it's so much of the character of the country, I would argue, Scott, that has changed so much and so dramatically over the last few years. The polarization, taking too much of our cues from political culture, which is just bent on division. I'm not sure that we're ever going to find our common humanity through that lens specifically. I think it's more in the everyday people, the people who teach our children. And, well, look at the pandemic. People have been on the front lines of that pandemic, who stock the grocery shelves and deliver the mail. Those are the people who have the most resonance in our life. And when we look down the journey that has been our own voyage, and you ask people, so who was your lighthouse? I haven't met anybody yet who has to spend a lot of time thinking about it. They know. We all know. Because as life and time moves on, you realize the whole trajectory of my life is different, if not for that elementary school teacher, if not for that high school coach, if not for that first boss. That person in that interaction that we talked about earlier, they most times unknowingly put all of this in motion. They put all of this in motion, and they don't even know it.
And you're talking about these people down to like a positive interaction. But what do you think about the idea that, and I'm just going to throw this out there, that these negative interactions that we have could be lighthouses as well?
Well, they often tell you what not to do and what not to be. In my 20s, I worked in college admissions. And so I was the person who read your application. I was the person whose signature was at the bottom of the letter. So you interacted with a lot of young people through my visits to high schools, and you interacted with a lot of families. Scarlett, everything I know about parenting, I learned working in college admissions, and specifically what not to do. I just saw behaviors, living through one's child, everything. And though being married and being a dad was a decade away, I remember thinking at 23 years old, 24 years old, whatever you do, don't do that. Don't do that. It became a guide. I look at the journey that is my own parents' lives, and I had the same kind of reaction. Don't do that. Don't do that. And oftentimes, the reason that cycles are repeated is because we don't frame another narrative for how to deal with pain and suffering. And you've got to find another, because that pain has to go somewhere. It has to. And if it goes inward, then that leads to self-destruction. So where does pain go? And whether that's pain over getting terminated, a divorce, the end of a friendship, a disappointment on a project, where does pain go? It's got to go somewhere. And oftentimes, if it doesn't go somewhere, it's going to get directed inward, and then another series of behaviors kind of unfold. I saw my father, self-destruction, very, very talented athlete, one of the top amateur fighters in the country and probably the world, but he was hurting over the disintegration of his own family. And so that pain he initially poured into boxing, but when that didn't work out, it turned inward, and it cost him his life, and it cost me a father. I learned from that.
That's incredibly powerful. And you're right. The pain has to go somewhere. And it's my feeling that we have to have some amount of coping skills and the ability to choose where we put that pain. Because how would we know that, I have so much pain, but I can use it to help somebody else? If not you're an incredible role model for that. You've done it, you're teaching it, you have that message that's out there. And it's the message of our time, actually, Steve, because there is so much pain. I'm on the road, I'm in schools, I'm talking to kids and educators and parents. And there's I think an unprecedented amount of pain. And also we're in an unprecedented time in our history where there's so much fear out there and uncertainty, and our brains just want to stay safe. So in other words, a super pandemic of anxiety, and it's all coming around to, the bottom line is, do we have the skills, the essential life skills we need to be able to take what's happening now in our lives, learn from it, grow through it, and be strengthened by it, and then use what we learn to help others? I mean, that's where we are right now. We're trying to get this ChooSELove movement out there, a free, comprehensive character, social, emotional development program to kids so that they have these skills and tools so that they can make the choice. So important. And, at the same time, I just got off a conversation with a friend the other day who knows someone who's a foster parent. They took in a young boy with fetal alcohol syndrome who is, I always say, if you don't have the words, if you're don't have the emotional intelligence to be able to say how you feel, it's going to come out in your behavior. And so that's exactly what's happening. And, but to the point where it's dangerous, not only to the little boy, but to the people around him. And yet he does have a family that's trying to advocate for him, but, they're being stretched as well. I mean, yes. What do you say to foster parents out there that are listening to this or who know someone what are your words of encouragement for them?
Well, first, foster parents are to me salt of the earth. They're they should be treated and viewed in the same way that we see first responders in a way,
Yes,
because that's
I
this
agree.
intervening step that they are taking, and it is challenging because there is always a history there, and it's always an inherited one because the child has done nothing wrong. And that's the first thing I would say to foster parents is that the child has committed no crime. They've done nothing to deserve that inheritance, because it is an inheritance, specifically. And you may be their only chance in the world. You may be it. I mean, if you look down the road and you see how some of these situations do not turn out well, that chance that comes in the form of foster parents it never happened. The other is that it is certainly, it's a longer process. There's this wonderful Greek proverb that says a society grows great when the elders of that society plant trees in whose shade they know they will never sit. You don't always get to see exactly how the story turns out. None of us live long enough to see that. And so we'd like to think that we will see in our lifetime the full picture of how that story turns out. Now, we'll see a partial picture for sure, but we won't see, the full picture. And yet isn't that the essence of faith, right? Isn't that the essence of love? For those foster parents who deal with very, very challenging situations, and they see that as the children get older and become adults and make choices that hurt. I was actually talking to someone two days ago who described to me her parents adopting a child at 7 months old and gave him all the love that they gave her, and they were raised together. And he just, as he got older, could not overcome those demons. And so her parents wanted to ask me through her about that. And I said, you did the single most important thing anybody could ever do. You gave him a chance. You gave him a chance. That's the same thing I talked to my three about. Mom and dad, our responsibility is to give you that chance, but we cannot make you take it. God gives us free will. And if God gives us free will in choosing God, then you can almost certainly believe that he's going to give you free will in choosing advice or counsel or direction or love in this case. I can't make you choose that. The only thing that I can do is say, here's the door. And behind that door is magic and new beginnings and love and grace and gratitude and a place where the pain, you'll look back on it and it won't seem as large. But I cannot walk through that door for you. Those foster parents literally gave him that chance, but we can't make the choice for you. But that doesn't fully heal you, of course, but you hope that it gives some comfort, because they did do that. They loved him as best as they could for as long as they could.
That's beautiful. And I have a family member that's going to really resonate with as well. That is really beautiful. What about the parents that are listening that didn't have great parental role models and are maybe, if you do what you know, and so maybe they are recreating some of their parents' dysfunction in their own lives. I think that happens a lot. I know I've even done that a little bit. And so what advice would you give to those parents who, you have to want to change, but that do and that are willing to commit the effort to doing that?
Yes. Shakespeare referred to parents as heaven's lieutenants. He said, because to children, they are the voice of God. That's how powerful parents are, according to Shakespeare.
Yes.
And when you realize just how powerful that is, you begin to see that revisitation of how you were parented has to be part of your calculus, whether it was good, whether it was bad, whether it was indifferent. There has to be some reckoning and realization of how you were parented, and to realize it does influence the way that you show up as a parent. It absolutely does. There's an old story about a mother who's sitting on a front porch with her two daughters who are both pregnant at the same time. And the girls are going on and on with their mom about how they're not going to make the mistakes that she made with them. And it was clear it was a loving relationship, so they were teasing her a bit. And the mother's listening to this for a while. And this girl, she leans over and she gently pats both of their bellies and she says, "That's okay, girls. You're going to make new mistakes." Right? Make new mistakes. Like parenting to me 101, make new mistakes. Don't make old ones. Make new mistakes. And even those mistakes, when they come from a place of love and compassion, are understandable to children later on. And to be cognizant, especially when they were adverse parenting that you endured and went through. It's no accident that children who are abused, not always, but sometimes abuse their own children. Why is that? Because that's their frame of reference for parenting. And so you have to find another way. So, and I grew up in a world where corporal punishment was the way that punishment was meted out. And it was barbaric by any definition. It was barbaric because that's how that foster family was. I had to be very cognizant of that. And so I do not and have not spanked my children. In this universe, taking their phone away hurts a whole lot more. But I remembered, what did I remember? I remembered the fear. I remembered the fear more than anything else. That was worse than anything else, even being hungry, because at least I could figure out a way to steal food from them. But fear just consumed your every being. And so even when I've had to summon my children in for a conversation, and the first thing they'll say, "Am I in trouble?" And I can see the fear. And I'm like, hey, and I still remember feeling that way. And I'm like, well, there's some things we have to talk about, but it doesn't require you to be afraid, right? It doesn't require you to be afraid. And just taking a calculation of your own parenting and to be resolved that you have this power as a parent to end a cycle. They were parented because that's how they parented you that way, because that's how they were parented. And so you can end, has been a cycle, and oftentimes is a cycle of parenting.
That's a great point. And if you don't put the effort in, and it is effort and awareness to end the cycle, then that's how your kids most likely will parent their kids. And is that what you want for your kids?
Absolutely not. And you talk to a few grandparents and they see their children parenting, and they're like, oh my God. And they don't want to, they don't want to admit that. Was I that bad? Was that? Because they know that's what they saw, right? And so there's a degree of patience and understanding, and always revisitation. It's okay for our spouses to hold up a mirror sometimes to our parenting, and say, hey, is that really the messages that you want to be conveying? And it doesn't mean that all the parental messages of discipline and accountability and responsibility, I'm not suggesting that those are to be avoided at all. What I am saying is that they can be administered a bit differently than how we were parented.
So important. And so, Steve, when you work with, I know you work in corporations and you provide executive coaching. What are the major issues that you are seeing right now?
It's something that you were hinting at a bit earlier, and it is the broader way that we're engaging and interacting, the cynicism, the polarization, the carping at one another, the suspension of morality, the seeming unwillingness to see in someone else a part of our own story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's costing us a great deal. And it's not what future generations did. I mean, past generations, that's not what they did. So the world in which we live today is largely because they did the opposite of what we seem to be doing. You know, they when something was amoral or wrong, they leaned into it. By their own admission, they would say not always successfully, but they were cognizant of it. They didn't dismiss it or deflect it. That's many of the lessons of our grandparents, who are, if you're in your 50s, they're considered the greatest generation. That was for a reason. They did some really tough stuff, made sacrifices that are unimaginable in our day. Going off to a war, relatively certain you're not going to come back. Mm-hmm. Avoiding nuclear war, standing on the front lines of a civil rights movement. I mean, these were tough things they did. And yet here we are, seemingly in a different kind of battle against ourselves. And oftentimes is driven by people who absolutely do not deserve the adulation and the recognition that they seem to be getting, either because it's superficial. You know, division, Scarlett, is a business model. It drives advertising. It gets you votes. Fear is a business model, and it perpetuates it. I always have this back and forth with my wife. I don't watch the news. And because the first 6 stories, you're going to get bombarded by cynicism and rushing to crime scenes and interviewing families in the midst of pain. And it's all driving fear. It's selling fear. Mm-hmm. So you have to be so conscious of how you start your day. Like, even if you start your day by doing this, mm-hmm. and looking at the mayhem in the world, that seeps into one's consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so you have to find these other lighthouse moments, right? Every day. Let me give you an example of that. Every day I get up early. Part of my beginning my day, I'm an early riser. So I'll get up and I drive one town over because it's quiet and it's a nice neighborhood that I'm driving through. And I stop and get Dunkin' Donuts. I'm from New England, so Dunkin' Donuts are on every corner. I'm in the Midwest these days. And when I stop drive-through in Hugo, he's at the drive-through every day. And my interactions with him are never longer than a minute because of somebody behind me. But I've learned so much about Hugo over the years. I know how many children he has. I know what country he's from. I know what time his shift starts. I know when he's looking for more hours. Always those interactions with Hugo and then Lucy, who's there when he's not there. Sometimes they work together. They become like my friends, mm-hmm. And they just kind of anchor me each and every day, a blur of things coming at me. And I just think pointing our own kind of example from those everyday folks, there's something restorative to me. In that. And so a lot of leaders, especially in the business world that I'm in, they're seeing the effects of this. And they're too wondering, what is as corporations, what is our societal responsibility? Because not enough, I'm just going to go for drive shareholder value, make profit. No, I have this greater responsibility to society. So it's why you see them leaning in, especially after the murder of George Floyd, and realizing that there are some systemic inequities that we have to address. They're leaning into what women have encountered in the workplace, specifically vis-a-vis the Me Too movement, right? I mean, there's this greater responsibility that organizations have to reshape and reframe the social constructs and narratives in the way in which we engage and interact, because those are people, especially in the midst of a pandemic, they showed us the way, and they continue to show us the way.
Absolutely. I totally agree. So when you're talking about Jose and Lucy, You're talking about what you were talking about in the beginning, these interactions, these short interactions, of really giving and receiving love. And we're all about interactions, and we're all about this social connection. And I agree with you, the fact that we are, I guess we're maybe coming out of a social distancing era, regardless of how short it's been. It has really, there's a toll that's going to have to be paid. And we're seeing it in 30% increase in homicides and death by drug overdose last year. I mean, we're seeing there's a direct correlation to that. And so for you to choose not to go on and start your day with the negativity, but to focus on that interaction with another human being. And you're talking about in the drive-through lane of the Dunkin' Donuts, giving and receiving love right there is you're helping somebody, and they're helping you to start your day off well. And that's so important. And you're right. I totally agree that corporate America has to take on a bigger responsibility, and not just corporate America, but each and every one of us. I mean, we live in this world, and we are responsible ultimately for what goes on in it. And I know that it would be so great if someone would swoop in and fix all of these issues for it. And for us, I think sometimes we wait for that. And in the end, it's going to have to be us.
It is. And I think we've seen, especially politically, the consequences of that kind of savior mentality, and ceding that responsibility to another. Claire Levin, who brought me books, did not do that. She didn't say, well, I hope somebody else is going to bring in books. She didn't say it's not my responsibility. She took the exact opposite tact and approach. And, for anyone who's listening to this conversation who thinks, what Scarlett and Steve are talking about is this kind of soft, squishy, altruistic, too earnest. What are they talking about? Love. And what does it have to do with some of the harder things in life? Well, it's the reason we remember Martin Luther King as fondly as we do, and why his legacy has endured as long as it has, because he was exactly right. That is the only way that you can really steward your way through these kinds of things. We are indeed in unprecedented times. The American experience and the American experiment was, and the American dream was actually not coined by the founding fathers. It was a far more recent vintage. It was actually first articulated by a Depression era writer. His name was James Truslow Adams. And he said, the American dream is his book, written in 1931, Eve of the Great Depression, called The Epic of America. And what he said was, the American dream is really about one thing more than anything else. It's about mobility. Can I do better than my parents? Can my children do better than me? That's the American dream. And we distilled that down into a house and a white picket fence. And he said that was predicated on two things: your own ambition and whether or not you have the opportunity. Well, when opportunity is restricted, in this case, in the form of massive income inequality, everything that you just described prior is what happens when the ramps of mobility have changed, and they have changed. We have people born in the zip codes, and if you drive through those zip codes, whether it's in rural America or in the cities of America, you drive through and you would be right in your question to ask, how are you going to get out of here? Crumbling schools, no infrastructure, no banks. How in the world are you going to get out of here? Why? What is that about? That's about mobility, the ability to move beyond. And when you don't have that, it's no wonder you have record levels of addiction and incarceration and homicide and family separations, because that was Adam's point. When you don't have that, people, then they lose hope and then they get angry. And to be angry and apathetic at the same time is a very, very dangerous combination. And that pain that we talked about earlier, I'm angry about my lot in life, and I am resolved that there is nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do about it. And that leads to self-destruction. That was my father's story. There's nothing I can do about this. I have this talent, but that's all I've got. I've been denied love. He literally said that. This love thing, this is not for me. I wasn't born for that. And that's what happened. I think that's happening over and over and over again. So we have this, to Claire Levin's point, we have this responsibility to lean into that, actually. We have to do that for our sake, for our children's sake, for their children's sake. Otherwise, this country won't be recognizable to us in a very, very short period of time. And lastly, on that point, stop turning that responsibility over to the affluent and the celebrity and the politician. Far too often, those folks are going to disappoint you. I mean, they often do, to be candid. But the lighthouses in our life, well, there's a reason that we remember them, because they were the opposite end of that. They leaned into our lives, and we're forever grateful to them for having done so.
I love that, Steve. And I often say, if those people that you mentioned, if they could have fixed it, they would have, because they are suffering like we are, maybe in different ways, but they absolutely have a child that has committed suicide or is on drugs or bullied something. They have felt the pain. If they could have fixed it, they would have. and simply, to me, that means that we all need to take responsibility and stop passing the buck and saying, this is too big for me, because it's not, because we're all living in this world, and we all have a reason and a purpose for living here. And once you realize that and take responsibility, then you can be part of the solution. And I love that. And in that vein, Steve, I want you to know that in New Hampshire, we started working with at-risk youth. And through that work, we became involved in the foster care system there. And now ChooSELove and this character social emotional development programming is mandatory. And a mandatory part of their foster care system in New Hampshire. And I just wanted to tell you that because the turning point for me, I will say, is my son's murder, because I was that person. And I'll freely admit this, 9 years ago, looking at the school shootings and saying, oh gosh, that's horrible. It truly is. I feel bad for that, but that will never happen to me, for one thing. And number two, what can I do about it? There's nothing I can do about it. Yeah. All I can do is go home, be the best mom to my two boys, raise good sons, and then put them out into the world. And then I've done my job. Right. But, and you know what? I probably would continue to think that, except that, Jesse was murdered, and it woke me up to the realization that no, we all have to take responsibility, and we can't continue to blame, even Adam Lanza or his mom. Yes, they're responsible for their mistakes, but if they're not responsible for the trend, they're not responsible for the hundreds of other school shootings that have happened since Sandy Hook. So then you have to say, well, who is? And then you realize, oh, wait a minute, it may be us. And it's actually a good feeling, because you talked about that hopeless and helpless feeling. And I think a lot of people are looking out into the world today, having that helpless, hopeless feeling that does lead to anger and rage and is most likely, absolutely part of the increasing homicide rate. And when we take the time to realize we are personally responsible, we return what's called the locus of control to inside of us, and we start making things happen, even if it's baby steps, even if it is consciously going out every day and saying, how can I have a lighthouse moment today? I'm going to have one lighthouse moment today.
Mhm.
And it can be anything. It can be at the drive-through at Dunkin' Donuts. It can be something outside of your normal everyday life, outside of your kids, outside of your family and friends, but reaching outside your comfort zone, because it's only then that we grow, and having that one lighthouse moment that I believe can change the world.
And often does when we look down the span of our lives. John Sykes, who took me in, he described that as saying yes. That over the course of our life, we all have this opportunity to say yes. And it's undeniable. You can't pretend you didn't hear. You can't pretend you didn't hear. And so, saying yes, isn't that powerful and instructive, for all of us. The moments in our life that have such an impact upon us because somebody said yes for us or to us. But as a people, the lighthouses in my life made it abundantly clear to me that was not free. It was clear that I had a responsibility to say yes. And so each day presents this opportunity to say yes. Some years ago, after my first book was written, I received a letter from a fifth grader. Scarlett, was so beautiful. And I was working at Walgreens at the time. My assistant put it on a stack of mail because she wanted to make sure that I saw it. And as soon as I saw it, I said, well, I wasn't thinking of lighthouses at the time, but I thought, well, I had a favorite author in the fifth grade. And you know what? I'm going to go to that young man's school and I'm going to surprise him. I call the teacher. The teacher begins helping me plan it. She says, I have to get permission from the principal. The principal says, no, it's late in the year. It's not on our calendar. I don't know this man. Teacher is a bit disappointed by that and says, well, I'm going to bring you the book you wrote and you can read it over the weekend and then let me know if you've changed your mind. And so next day she walks into the principal's office, hands her a chance in the world, walks out, gives, quick interaction. And she's barely through the doorway before she hears the principal say, well, how soon can he come? And, she just caught off guard because she had just given her a litany of reasons why she couldn't. And at one point, the teacher says, well, don't you want to read that? Don't you want to learn a little bit more about him? And the principal says, well, I'm sure that there's some things about him that I'm going to learn from this. She says, but a lot of this I already know because I was that man's second grade teacher 40 years before.
Wow.
When Julian was writing to me, he did not know that his principal was once my second grade teacher. And I, in responding to him, did not know that either. So here I am thinking that what am I doing? I'm saying yes, right? Interaction. Now that was coming from the people who made sure that I understood I had a responsibility. And I think there's a lot of lessons in that, of course. But here you are thinking that you're doing something for that young man. And yes, I was, but he was also doing something for me. And as it turned out, for my second grade teacher who hadn't known how I turned out.
Oh, incredible story. I urge everyone to get both of your books and read them and be a lighthouse for someone. Do your part, take responsibility, be part of the solution. I will say that it does take courage to get to that yes a lot of times. That's why courage is our first character value that we teach in the ChooSELove movement. It does take a lot of courage, and it's going to take a lot of courage, especially in the face of what's going on now. You said that basically the foundation of a lot of the dysfunction is fear, and that is true. And fear is not the absence of difficulty. It's just the courage to walk through it. And it's so important. And you've really, you're an incredible role model. I'm so honored and thankful that you agreed to be on the podcast, Steve, and share your story with us. I'm looking forward to our book club and you coming back and discussing both of these books with us. Thank you so much. Do you have any final words of inspiration? You've already shared so much with us. I mean, this has been life-changing for me, and I'm so appreciative to you.
Well, I do have some final words, and they are about you and all that you have done. I appreciate your kind words about me. Just know that feeling is incredibly mutual. When I think of all the work that you have done, it is quite literally the personification of that proverb that I shared earlier. Planting trees in whose shade we don't ever really know how it turns out. And the lives, the awakenings that you've created, the new beginnings that you've created that we don't get to see is such a wonderful, testament to your life and how you embody one of the attributes of the Lighthouse, which is having the courage to encourage, to be willing to navigate your own pain and loss, to try and help somebody else through theirs. It is such an extraordinary gift. And I pray that you will continue that courage to encourage, because there are a lot of people out there who need you, Scarlett. So thank you for having me. I have so enjoyed this conversation. I'll be hard pressed to have a better one for the rest of this week. That's for sure.
I totally agree. Thank you so much, Steve. Everyone go out and be a lighthouse for someone. I know that I am. And thank you, Steve, so much. So appreciate you. Thank you I feel like, you're the epitome of choosing love. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, hey, oh. It's all part of us. We can all choose love. It'll lift you up if you let it in. Let the healing
Thanks for listening to the ChooSELove podcast. Our positive, empowering messaging is reaching millions of people all over the planet. Join the worldwide movement to choose love. Our programming is in over 10,000 schools, homes, and communities across the country, in every state and over 112 countries and counting. We're giving individuals of all ages the essential life skills they need to flourish. You can be part of the solution too. We have sponsorship opportunities available that help support us and enable you to share in helping create a safer, more peaceful, and loving world. Contact me on our website, ChooSELoveMovement.org.